So what we have here in front of us is a very valuable piece of artwork, but also it's a solid, great bit of silver that would have been worth a lot of money. It was made in Paris by a goldsmith between about 1480 and 1506, and the reason we can date that clearly is that the French king brought in some changes into the rules in how objects like these were hallmarked. This is an astonishingly valuable piece in its own right. There are simply no other examples that we can compare this particular silver gilt casket to from this period in France. One of the reasons for that is that in the late 1600s, Louis XIV, lots of wars, needed money, issued edicts saying, melt your valuable silverwork down and give me your silver. And as a result, pieces like this are almost non-existent. We are lucky that it made its way to Scotland. And this is where the other extraordinary bit of its history takes place, because it's believed that this casket was owned by Mary, Queen of Scots. Now, Mary is believed to have owned this casket, and it's thought that it was probably given to her by her husband, the French Dauphin, Francois, who in 1559, along with Mary, became King and Queen of France. Then when she came back to Scotland on Francois' death, bringing with her an awful lot of jewels, caskets, clothing. Some of the descriptions of her arriving back in Scotland are quite remarkable in the detail, and it's thought that this casket was one of those. So this is what gives it its singular appeal, is a belief in its association with Mary, Queen of Scots, one of the most iconic Scottish monarchs, and a person who remains very present in the public consciousness in Scotland and beyond into the 21st century. This is an object of really great virtuosity, the skill of the Parisian craftsman that made it. It has these elaborate bits of open work in straps across the lid and coming down at the sides. There are alternating patterns, so we've got straps with the scrolling leaves and flowers, and then these narrower straps of little flowerlets studding the top of the casket. The casket is also incredibly detailed in its prickwork that picks out the images of birds, and actually specifically, if I turn it round, we can see a deer with antlers. So I think it's probably speaking there, perhaps, to Mary's love of the hunt. But one of the remarkable things about it is that it weighs 1.8 kilograms. And I think if we open it, we can get a sense of how possibly Mary will have used it. It's really heavy, opening it. I'm sure she wouldn't have been quite as careful as I am being. We know from Mary's inventories that she owned a huge amount of really very valuable jewellery. But the other thing that she owned an awful lot of, and there are several references to them in her inventories, are rosaries or paternoster beads, including perhaps the pennicut jewels that we have here in the museum. These are the kinds of things that I think Mary would have stored within this box. But the box itself is something to be treasured. The fact that it has survived at all, but that also it has survived in such good condition, is testament to the strength, the power of that association of this casket with Mary, Queen of Scots. It simply wouldn't have survived if that hadn't been so. Gloria Patri et Filio et Spiritui Sancto. I think there is a very long shadow that casts backwards through her life because we know she comes to a tragic end. But the first half of Mary's life, a lot of it was spent in very promising circumstances. This epitomizes, it symbolizes that rather more joyful, majestic, elite, luxurious context in which Mary was brought up in France. And I think what that therefore allows us to think of her as is, instead of this rather tragic, brutal end, is that she was Queen of Scotland, Queen of France, and with a claim to the throne of England too. It allows us to reframe Mary as that magnificent, majestic Renaissance queen that she was in the late 1550s, and indeed when she came back to Scotland and took up the reins of government there. And this casket allows us to tell the next chapter of Mary's life. In 1567, Mary's second husband, Henry Lord Darnley, was murdered, and rather too hastily afterwards, Mary married Lord Bothwell. This engendered the opposition of a coalition of largely Protestant Scottish nobles who came together at Carberry Hill and forced Mary's surrender. Mary was taken into captivity, Bothwell escaped, and as she was then taken off to Loch Leven, where she was to spend the next year or so, an accomplice of her husband, Lord Bothwell, was arrested, and in his possession was, it is alleged, this particular casket. So the casket was taken before the Privy Council, led by the rather scary Earl of Morton, and he ordered it to be opened. So the lock was forced and opened, and its contents revealed. In 1567, no record was made, that we have anyway now, of what those contents were. But a year later, when the casket was given to Mary's half-brother, James Earl of Murray, to take down to London, it had mysteriously materialised a number of damning letters between Mary and Bothwell, and a marriage contract and a number of sonnets. And I think she still remains that slightly contentious figure today. Innocent victim, martyr, malicious, malignant woman. All these Marys are different Marys. So it really represents this seismic moment in Mary's life when she goes from being the former Queen of France, the existing Queen of Scotland, into a forced abdication and then subsequent captivity in England. And this casket was part of that story, part of the reason that Mary remained for the rest of her life in English captivity. Secula, secula.